Good morning. Oh, wide awake. How is everyone this morning? All right? It's good to see you all this morning. Today we are going to be in John chapter 5. How much do you mind living with something that maybe isn't working properly? What do you do with something when it's not working properly? Do you keep it or do you bin it? I mean, there's a question, right? I mean, a lot of stuff, right, that we have today, it's kind of encased in plastic, isn't it, right? And when it stops working properly, there's not much you can do about it. It's made to be disposed of anyway, so pretty much all you can do is chuck it away. But some stuff, right, you can fix, right? Like the other day, I had a bit of a software glitch in my computer, and I hadn't actually really noticed it before, and suddenly you're like, oh, that's odd, that shouldn't be doing that, and I just kind of lived with it until I noticed it. And then, of course, once I noticed it, it really bugged me, so, I spent ages and ages, you know how that is. It's like you start digging into that stuff, and you're like, there's a few hours gone, but I did solve it, and I got it to work again better. But things do break, don't they? And things do have glitches, and that's just kind of part of the world life that we live in this world. And one of the things that, can break most easily and have glitches in most easily is, of course, our bodies, isn't it? I know a lot of you are young and maybe you haven't experienced the joys of all that just yet, but believe you me, you will. And they're complicated things, bodies too. I know some of you are doctors here, so I should probably just shut up. But there's both hardware and software in you, isn't there? And things can break and go wrong. And sometimes, we just kind of let that fly, don't we? And sometimes when things go wrong, we don't really notice for a long time. I've bored you with this before, but in July we were away for a leadership retreat at the seaside, and was walking along the beach, and I felt my back go, and oh gosh. Anyway, usual thing, right? Back to the doctor and MRIs, and the bad news is, I have stenosis and these 3 areas that are pinching on nerves in there, and followed up with an epidural, and that was great for 12 hours until that wore off, and then back to the pain again. And then I went for the follow-up visit, I don't know, 6 weeks ago or so, and I was expecting the doctor to tell me you need to just go and do PT or something like that. And then he asked me this question. He said, do you want me to fix it for you? And it kind of took me aback, actually. I wasn't really expecting him to say that. And I didn't give him an immediate response. We're in the penultimate of our series this morning called God Questions, in which God has asked various people different kinds of questions, and we're looking at the moment Jesus asking people questions. And this morning we're going to look at Jesus asking a question to which he does not get a response to. And why doesn't he get a response from the person that he asked the question? And what if he asked you that question this morning? Actually, he is asking you that question here this morning. And what kind of response will you give him? Well, you might want to know what the question is, so we should probably read the text, right? John 5, verse 1 through 18, and we'll find out what Jesus asks. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethsaida, which has 5 roof colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. And afterwards Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him, and that this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. You know, don't tell Leslie, but I'm not the only one getting older. We're both getting older, right? Last week we were at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Leslie was having a pancreas looked at there, because that's not functioning properly either. And you know, the Mayo Clinic is an amazing place. I hope you never have to go there, but if you do, it is a stunning place, frankly. And people go there from all over the world to try and get well, right? If you don't want to get well, you wouldn't bother going there. And they have specialists from all different things, you know, mending people who are broken, right? That body parts are not working properly. And I was thinking of this, that when I was there and seeing and watching all these people, you know, and some of them are obviously really, really struggling with their health. And I was thinking about how Jesus specialized in mending broken people. Like the Mayo Clinic of his day, if you like, except he knew exactly what was wrong, and he knew exactly how to heal people just with a word or with a touch. And I imagine people from all over flocking to Jesus, just like going to the Mayo Clinic and queuing up round the block just to be touched by Jesus, just to have a turn with Jesus so that Jesus could heal them. But this chap we're talking about here had not come to find Jesus at all, had he? In fact, Jesus came to find him. And that's kind of comforting, I think, to me anyway, that Jesus knows where we are. And Jesus knows where to find us, right? Even when we're kind of tucked away, out of sight, out of mind from the world around us. Let's put this passage in context. You know how much I like to put scripture in context so we don't go off on a wild goose chase where we shouldn't go. John starts off this passage, "After this," he says. Well, after what exactly? And we have to remember that John's gospel is not arranged in chronological order, right? It didn't go, Jesus did this and in this order. That's not what John's interested at all in. He's interested in theologically sticking stuff together and in themes and making a point of who Jesus is. Remember, John's gospel starts off, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God," right? That's his whole aim in his gospel, to show that Jesus is God. And that's, Jesus uses these whole series of I am statements in the gospel of John. And John's gospel is crafted around 7 miracles that John particularly focuses in on, which are actually, you know, they're signs that point to who Jesus is, that God speaks through his works. And the first 2 things that Jesus does are in Cana, in Galilee. Remember the first one, he's invited by his mother to go to this wedding, and the groom has made a big mistake. He hasn't ordered enough wine to see through the wedding feast, and they run out halfway through, and Jesus makes wine. Like 100 gallons plus of wine, and not just some cheap nasty plonk that you buy in 7-Eleven or somewhere, but the best vintage, right? The absolute best vintage of wine. And the second sign he also does in Cana a little bit later, when an official comes to him and begs Jesus to come and heal his son who's sick. And Jesus says, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And that "you" there is, by the way, it is plural. He's not just talking to the man, he's talking to everybody in general, right? And the man knows, no, please, Jesus, you need to come with me to Capernaum and heal my son. And Jesus tells him to go, your son is well. And the man believes Jesus, and he starts heading home, and as his servants come and meet him on the way, and he asks them what time his child started getting better, and it turned out it was the exact time that Jesus had told him to go. And so these two miracles, these two signs, right, they point to Jesus. Like he is the creator, right? With a word, he can change things, right, from water into wine. And he's the healer. And he doesn't even need to be present. Again, with just a word, he can say, that son is healed and he's better. And now Jesus is returning to Jerusalem. That's another emphasis in John's gospel, by the way, that very much John focuses his gospel around Jesus going to feasts in Jerusalem. And although this feast isn't specifically mentioned by name, it's most likely is the Passover. And we should keep that in the back of our minds as we go through this story, because who is the fulfillment of Passover? Jesus Christ, right? It all points to him. And of course, in the previous trip to Jerusalem in John's Gospel, he kind of got on the wrong side of the leaders, because he'd been a little upset when he went into the temple and found all those money changers there and people flogging sacrifices and stuff, and he drove them all out. And then he healed a number of people, and the authorities didn't like it. So what's he going to do now on his second trip back to Jerusalem in John's Gospel? And again, we ask that if Jesus walked in here this morning and asked you, do you want to be well? What would you say? What would your reply be to Jesus? And some of us might protest, right? Well, I'm perfectly well. I don't need Jesus' healing touch. Or others of us might say, well, we want to be well, but I can work that out by myself. I can make it happen by myself. Or maybe we haven't really noticed that there's anything wrong with us in the first place. With wellness comes healing, and with healing comes change and difference. And it might not be quite what we expect. Let's see what Jesus offers. To start with, he offers escape, right? He comes into the temple, and he goes to the part of the temple not where all the healthy people are. Just this, he goes to the place where the sick people are, who are struggling in life, this pool by the sheep gate. And it attracts people who are looking for healing, looking for escape from their different situations, whatever it is that they're struggling with. I had back surgery, I think it was 3 years ago. And I'd lived with that pain for years, actually, before I had that back surgery. And I thought that was just the way life was, right? That you just woke up and struggled on with it through the day, and that was that. But then after surgery, I woke up, and I could feel the pain from the surgery, but the back pain was gone. It's like, wow, that's different. That's wonderful. And we forget, don't we, what it's like. And we live with brokenness and struggles and pain and hurt, and we just kind of get used to it and accept it and get numb to it. In fact, it becomes our expectation, doesn't it? Well, that's just life. That's just the way things are. And we look at the world around us and we see the brokenness and the struggles and the pain and the hurt and the healing, and we think, well, that's just the way things are. And we have no greater expectation for ourselves or for the world or anyone around us than that. Except now and again, we might get a little tiny glimpse of what life could be like. Of being pain-free, of being brokenness-free. And we just get this little glimpse, and then suddenly it's gone, and it's all covered up again, and we're back to our normal expectations. What do you think this man's expectations were that day when he was by the pool? He'd been an invalid for 38 years. Now, I don't know if he'd been going there for 38 years, but presumably he'd been going there for a while. And presumably that was maybe his daily routine, right? That somehow somebody got him there, dropped him off, left him there all day, and he sat there with people who were just like him, broken, just like him. And maybe his expectation was to beg and to earn maybe just enough to get enough to earn supper for the night and make it through for another day. Do you think he expected any sort of escape that day whatsoever? In fact, when do you think the last time it was that he ever thought about escape from his situation in life, that he dreamed about it, that he even prayed about it? I think he just dismissed that long, long ago. You know, lots of people, I think, around here are in that very situation. I don't think we would have to go very far outside of these doors, right, out in the streets around us, and we would find many, many people in that same situation. And maybe that's you even this morning, that you're struggling and you've got something broken, and that's just what you expect every day to wake up with, and there's no hope of escape. You know, in his previous two miracles or signs, Jesus had been asked to intervene, right? I mean, the wine into water had been initiated by actually his mother's, request, right? And the official from Capernaum had come on behalf of his son. But here, Jesus initiates the conversation and the interaction. He zeroes in on brokenness in particular, doesn't he? Now, I can't tell you, out of all the people that were there by the sheep pool, waiting, hoping, Jesus goes to this one man. But he goes to bring glory to God, doesn't he? To reveal himself. Because that's what God does. I mean, really, that's what the Passover celebration is about. Why, that all the Jews, they were at the temple to celebrate, right, God freeing his people way back when they were Hebrew slaves in Egypt, and they were crying out to God in their slavery and their bondage, and God gave them a way of escape, leading them to a new land. And isn't that what we're doing here this morning? We're hoping, we're expecting that God is going to give us escape. We're going to escape. That God has offered us this way of escape. And the great thing is we get to pass that good news on to people around us, right? Wherever we go. We don't provide the escape. I can't give you any escape. I'm struggling as much as anybody else, right? But I know who can give you escape. And I think of Jesus when he called Matthew to be his disciple. I bet Matthew was absolutely gobsmacked that Jesus would call him, this tax collector, to come and join Jesus and follow Jesus. And he was delighted, wasn't he? That Jesus has suddenly offered him this way of escape. And Matthew went and called all his mates and then threw this massive great party for Jesus. And Jesus went and sat there with these tax collectors, and who knows who else was there too. And the Pharisees saw it and they didn't like it, did they? And they complained to Jesus' disciples, hey, what's your master doing hanging out with all these people? But Jesus overheard what they said. And he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus specializes in escape. And he's offering that to us this morning. And he's offering that to everyone we come across, right? Then we can tell them about the escape Jesus offers. So how's this man going to respond to Jesus' offer of escape? Well, he responds with evasion. He doesn't exactly leap at the chance, no pun intended, Jesus' offer, does he? In fact, he starts making these excuses about, well, I don't have anyone to help me, to get me into the pool, and, when the waters are stirred, and I suppose we need to do a quick explanation here. In the authorized version, there's this little section about how an angel would come down and every now and again and stir the waters, and the first one into the pool would be healed. There again, there's this man's expectation that you have to be first in the queue, right, to get God's healing. Well, Jesus dispenses with that, doesn't he? Well, I guess in this pool there was a natural phenomenon. At high water, the pool would get all stirred up. So anyway, you can do with that as you feel, as you wish. But I know, if you've been to a hot springs, right, and there's lots of minerals in it, it does have some healing properties in it. And we go looking for healing in all kinds of different places, don't we? I mean, the last few months I've been going to a chiropractor who's told me he's going to heal me, and it's helped a bit, but at the end of the day, he can't get rid of the arthritis that's pressing in on my nerves, Some people play the lottery, right? They think that's going to make their life better. If I can just win the lottery, then it's going to be great, right? And I know if you don't buy a ticket, you're never going to win, but your chances of winning are pretty remote, aren't they? It's kind of a myth that that's going to make your life better. A lot of people, when they even win the lottery, actually makes their life worse, not better at all. And we have this great wellness industry, don't we? People are always seeking natural healing now, and essential oils, and I'm going to get myself in trouble. So we'll just move on. CBD, and and during COVID, some of the stuff that came up during COVID, I had people offering me horse medicine. Come on. You might have reservations about the MRA stuff, but I'm not taking horse medicine, I'm sorry. And I don't know what it is about Christians. Sometimes we're more susceptible than everybody else to fall for all this stuff, right? I've listened to ads or infomercials on Christian radio stations offering this kind of stuff, and you go, what? I don't think so. And people make journeys to sacred sites because we're so desperate, aren't we, for healing of some kind. I knew a woman who had breast cancer. And she found this natural healer in California. And she made multiple trips down there. And it cost her a lot of money to go. And she was convinced, she was a good Christian woman too. And she was convinced that God was going to heal her through this well, I'm going to use the word quack, and I actually mean it too. And every time I would ask us, why don't you go to the doctor? And she had actually been to the doctor, and this was in Central Oregon, and in Bend they have a fantastic cancer treatment center, and the doctor had told her that if she got the surgery and did chemo, she would stand a good chance of living. But instead, she clung to that myth that this doctor was offering her, quack was offering her. And you know what happened to her? She died. And I could see it was not working. And everyone could see it was not working, but still she refused to believe and she clung to the myth. And I think about this man, that he's clinging to the myth, right? That if someone can get him to the pool and someone can get him in there, then he will be healed. And how many of us are just clinging to myths of one kind or another, that if we can just do this, or we can just get there, or just something, have the right diet, right exercise, whatever it might be, and I'm not saying any of that stuff's not important, but right job or right relationship, then we will be well, right? Or this time of year, if we can just find the right present, right? Then everything's going to be great. And yet Jesus comes along, right, and he challenges our myths about where we find healing and where we find wellness. You know, I've chatted as a pastor with many people over the years, different situations. Health, finances, relationships. Oh, Bryan, I've got this problem. And they say that they want to be well, and they say that they want to be healed. And my first question is, well, what have you done, right? And I've noticed that there's always a story, and there's always a story that involves evasion in that story. And he says, yeah, well, and they'll tell you something that they've tried to do, and say, well, that didn't work. So what have you done differently then? And it turns out they just keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I think that's the definition of insanity, isn't it? We can get stuck in a negative attitude too when we're in situations like that, right? When we're broken and we're hurting and we think change is never going to happen, but somehow we're still fixated on that myth of, right, that we're hoping in, and that's all people focus on. And I'm not saying all people, I mean, been there myself too, right? And you can become so negative and so down during those times, and it's so easy to fall into that way of thinking, and if only I could win the lottery, then everything will be better. It's funny how many people follow these myths, hoping for healing, hoping for wellness. And then when you mention Jesus, oh, well, Jesus, he can't do anything for me. In fact, some people say, oh, well, Jesus, he's a myth. He can't do anything for me. And they become evasive and give all the reasons why Jesus is not for them, right? Well, this is why I can't come to church, and this is why I can't be part of a community, and this is why I can't read about Jesus. But of course we know that Jesus is the only way to healing, and that Jesus is not a myth. Because like Peter says in his second letter, for we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. We ourselves heard this very voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain, while in a race only the first one receives the prize. But we are not in a race. Through the gift of God's grace, we have all received the prize. And Jesus stands before us this morning and he asks us, do you want to be healed? Do you want to be well? And what will we answer him? Yes, or still follow our myths? The next thing which often prevents us from responding is our environment. You know, Jesus doesn't wait for the man to answer, does he? He says, get up, you're healed. And the man does. And he gets up and he picks up his mat and off he trundles. But of course, it's not long before he runs into a new set of problems because it's the Sabbath and he's spotted carrying his mat. And of course, that's considered work and he gets into trouble. You know, the reason I hesitated answering the back surgeon's question, apart from being, I was slightly surprised, is that when you fix one problem, it can push it up to another area and cause another problem. Because the real problem is the stenosis and it's narrowing all the way down, and none of that is going away. And each surgery makes your back a little bit weaker, and does the cost the benefit outweigh the cost kind of thing, right? Does it make it worse? I've read some commentators who say that this man must have had faith in order for Jesus to heal him, and that he demonstrated faith. Far be it from me to disagree with people who are probably much more learned than I am, but I'm afraid that's not the way that I read it in this passage at all. I don't think he showed any sign of faith. Sometimes you read in the Bible that lack of faith inhibits God's work, right? There's a time when Jesus goes to Nazareth and it says that he couldn't do very much because of their lack of faith, and Jesus was pretty gobsmacked about the whole thing. But if God couldn't work when there was no faith, then we'd all be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't we? I'm speaking for myself here, but I think for all of us, because God can work through no matter what, right? Whether there's faith or not. And I think when Jesus told him to stand, that the healing maybe had already taken place, and he knew that something was different with his legs. And yes, there was some obedience there as he jumped up, but he already felt it, and maybe it was just out of sheer shock. I don't know exactly. I am conjecturing here. But in a daze, anyway, he wandered off, didn't he? And he wandered about in the crowds, and he didn't know what to do, right? He's clutching his mat, and he's got this new life that he never expected to have that morning. What am I supposed to do? 38 years I've been lying around, not able to walk, and now I'm able to walk. What am I supposed to do? What's he supposed to do now? He'd never imagined this. And yet he still lived in that same environment. And really that environment that he lived in didn't really want him healed at all. And that's true for us this morning. The environment that we live in doesn't want us to be well. It doesn't want us to be healed. It's incredible to me that the Jews see him carrying the mat, and they don't even mention the fact, nowhere do they mention the fact that this bloke is now walking. I mean, I know he was tucked away in the corner of the temple, but he'd been there a long time. I'm sure most of them had seen and known that he could not walk. And yet they saw him as a threat. And that's what happens when people get well. Do you know that? That if there's an addict, codependent kind of a relationship, and one of them gets well, do you know what the other one tries to do? They don't like it. And they try to pull them back down again to where they were before, because that is threatening. And it's threatening to them because if that person gets well, then that challenges my stuff in me, right? And I might have to do something about my life too. And look at my things, because I don't have that person there in this dysfunctional relationship to keep me going. And we don't like it when people change. And especially when people change that we can't explain why and how they changed, because that really, really challenges us. And especially people that we look down on, right? That we look down on, and we use those people we look down on to bolster our own images. And then suddenly they get better and they start doing life well, or maybe even better than we're doing. Well, we don't like that. Who are we going to look down on now? That's kind of the whole peer pressure, isn't it, thing, when someone tries to escape and out of their situation and everyone else is just trying to pull them back down again because it challenges the people who are kind of left behind. Because when we're healed by Jesus, we can't remain the same. Jesus changes us. He makes our life different. I mean, this bloke, he couldn't go back to begging again, could he? Because everyone's just seen him walking around the temple. That's done, mate. You're done. You're going to have to do something else. And I don't know about you, but change is hard. And it's difficult. And I have sympathy for this man, 38 years and suddenly he can walk and he's going to have to change his whole life and his way of thinking and all of it, right? And no longer can his focus be on the myth of getting first to the pool because that's done. He doesn't need that anymore. And we don't need those myths, right? Because we've been made well by Jesus. So now what? That's why community and discipleship is so important. Because we live in this environment that doesn't want us to change and be like Jesus, and it's continually around us, whether we realize it or not, trying to drag us back down to where we came from. Because it doesn't like it. Caleb and I, on Friday, we chatted with some leaders from the Union Gospel Mission, and I asked them what the wait list was like to get in, to the program of the Union Gospel Mission. Because I kind of imagined that it would be like months before you could get into the program. And they said, someone can come in here any time that we have space available. And they said, in fact, for all the different agencies around here, there's beds available for any person who wants to come in off the streets and get off drugs and alcohol. I was like, wow, well, that's not really what you hear, is it, right? And why is that? And the reason is because to come in off the streets, you have to give up something, right? And that involves change. And change is hard and change is difficult. And I'm not having a go at people because I'm the same way too. I find change hard and difficult when Jesus wants me to give up stuff and change my life. And when we try and do that by ourselves, we don't stand a chance. That's why it is so important for us to be a church, to be a community, to have life groups, to do, as Bonhoeffer says, life together. Because we live in this environment that doesn't want us to do that. The man and Jesus at the time, they lived in this environment that was governed by all these rules and regulations and, just trying to stop him from changing, right? And life is framed by the environment in which we live. But one time, Jesus was walking with his disciples through this grain field, and it was the Sabbath, and they were picking ears of wheat. Have you ever done that? No. It's really sweet, when the wheat is green and you can just suck on the grain. It's really sweet. Anyway, I digress. A little relapse moment there. And the Pharisees saw it, right? And they got on the disciples' case because plucking the stuff was considered like work. And what was Jesus' response? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And when Jesus asks us, do you want to be well, we need to remember that Jesus is the Lord of the environment in which we live. So lastly, this man is made well. What does he need? Well, he needs to be encouraged. Well, this man, he doesn't know who Jesus is. I don't know if he'd really looked at Jesus, but obviously not. But when he's confronted about carrying his mat, he's pretty quick to blame Jesus, isn't he? Oh, it's not my fault, mate. No, it's nothing to do with me, governor. It's that man who healed me. Blame him. And Jesus later finds him and warns him not to sin in case anything worse happens to him. And then as soon as he learns Jesus' identity, what does he do? Goes back to the authorities. Hey, I know who it is that healed me. It's that Jesus bloke that you've all been looking for. And he shops him to the authorities. What does it look like to be well? You ever ask yourself that question? A lot of people would say, well, being physically fit, or having a big bank account, or the right car, or the right houses, or whatever it might be. I've been reading this book lately by Philip Yancey called, Undone. And it's basically, he's taken these devotions that this guy, John Donne, wrote. And John Donne lived way back in the 16th century. And he lived in London through this time of plague, where thousands were dying each day, right? And Donne himself got sick, and the doctors thought he had the plague too. Turned out that he didn't have the plague, and they gave him all this medicine that pretty well killed him, but he survived. And I don't know what he had, typhus or something. But during it all, he wrote these devotions, and at one of the devotions, he was musing about reflecting on how disease produces physical symptoms. And then he was reflecting on, but what about spiritual disease? What does that produce? Jeremiah says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And who can understand it? What are the symptoms of spiritual disease? You can't help read this story in John chapter 5 here and compare it with a later story in John when again Jesus does another sign and he heals a blind man's sight. And that story starts off with the disciples coming across this blind man and asking Jesus, well, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus dismisses that, right? He says, well, neither of them. This man is going to give glory to God. And that sin is not responsible for the blind man's condition. And so he refutes that common belief at that time that sin was responsible for people's conditions. But sometimes sin is responsible for our condition, isn't it? And clearly, in this instance, whatever this man had done, sin was responsible for his condition. And sometimes sin is responsible. I mean, if you have the sin of gluttony, you go out and eat McDonald's all day long, every day, and suck down sugary sodas, and you have bad health, well, that is a result, right? That's what you get. Sin does have a negative effect on the body. And Jesus, with the blind man, he made mud, and he rubbed it in the man's eyes and told him to go and wash. And it's kind of similar, right? The man does so, he can see, and again it's the Sabbath, and Jesus gets in trouble, right? Because he's made mud on the Sabbath. And the difference is with the blind man, though, when they start questioning him, although he too doesn't know who Jesus is, he stands up for Jesus. He says, well, he must be someone from God. He thinks he's a prophet to start with, right? Jesus finds both of them after they've had encounters with the authorities. And Jesus goes to encourage both of them. That's another encouraging thing, right? Jesus doesn't just leave us to fend for ourselves. He finds us to encourage us. And again, we don't know exactly what this man had done. But we can see kind of from what he does after Jesus has found him, that he still goes back and he's still blaming and not accepting personal responsibility and still making excuses. And this time he blames Jesus, doesn't he? In some ways, I see him kind of the forerunner of Judas, Jesus asked the question, do you want to be well? And again, that's the question he asks all of us. So he doesn't exclude anybody, right? It's not God who excludes people. We exclude ourselves with the answer that we give or don't give. When the Jews find out that it's Jesus that's behind all this, then they get kind of worked up, don't they? And they find Jesus, and Jesus tells them that my Father is working and now I am. Because ever since the fall, God has been working to heal people. That's what the Bible's about. Bringing people back into wellness. And the ultimate pinnacle of his plan is Jesus Christ himself, who is going to offer eternal healing and wellness. Because sin is illness, isn't it? We just lit the candle of peace. And while we have illness in us, we have no peace. But Jesus offers us peace. That's why he came into this world, to bring healing to those who want it. And we're here this morning to encourage one another. Because the temptation, like if we go back to the Passover, is when the Hebrews came out of Egypt, they wanted to go back. They'd been offered to go to this land that was flowing with milk and honey, and yet they wanted to go back. And we need encouragement. And that's what we need to do. We get encouragement from God's word this morning, from prayer. I was thinking of John's third letter, and maybe you don't read that so much, but there's always this interesting bit. He writes this letter to a chap called Gaius. And he says, "Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul." It always fascinates me, that little sentence there. What would it look like if our physical health reflected the health of our soul? What would it look like in me? What would it look like in you? What would it look like in our church body? Do we want to be well? Well, we need all the encouragement that we can get. And that's the conclusion, really. Do you want to be well? It seems like a no-brainer question. Well, yeah, of course, I want to be well. And yet, as you dig into it, well, do we really want the chance to escape? Do we really want to be set free from our environment? Or do we become evasive and go, well, you know? And do we really give each other the encouragement we need? What's God speaking to you this morning as he asks you that question, or us that question as a church? Do we want to be well? Daniel's going to come up and play. We're going to grab the elements of communion. The bread and the juice are sitting on that table over there. Don't take them till right now. Bring them back. And at the conclusion of Daniel's song, we'll take it together. But just consider now the question, do you want to be well? And if you want some prayer, I'm just going to stand over there. More than happy to pray with you.